Good afternoon. The Inter-University Center for Terrorism Studies welcomes you today for their conference, Combating Terrorism, a review of 2021 and future outlook of 2022. This program is being conducted on January 20th, 2022, with opening remarks from Professor Don Wallace, Chairman of the International Law Institute.
Well, thank you, Bob. I'm Professor Wallace. As Bob said, I want to welcome you all to this program. As you can see from its description, it's very general and ambitious in reviewing counterterrorism, terrorism developments, domestic and foreign, last year and prospects for this year. The only word that occurs to me is we really must have perspective in all this. We tend to get lost in the weeds quite often. At this point, I would normally turn the program over to Yona, who is in charge of everything. But if Jennifer is here, I'll let Jennifer might say a few words on behalf of the Potomac Institute.
One thing that I do want to just do a quick introduction with the Institute is, as many of you know, we've looked at these issues for over 25 years in the today's environment, global environment, looking at terrorism, staying off shores and how domestic terrorism has been handled, and even looking at current events with Ukraine. There's certainly a lot to talk about and a lot to be prepared for coming in 2022. So I don't want to take any time. I think the conversation that you guys are going to have today is fantastic and right on par. I do want to invite General Gray for a couple of comments. He should be logged in with Catherine Young. If we can bring him up real quick, he's sitting at the Potomac Institute while I'm home today.
Well, no, I just want to welcome everybody to the seminar. Let's go ahead and get started.
Welcome to our invited distinguished speakers and also attendees, many of our colleagues, the U.S. and internationally. Of course, we know that the purpose of this forum is to provide a terrorism landslide, I think, perspective of the United States last year, all the way from the January 6th U.S. Capitol case to the hostage situation of the Jewish synagogue in Texas. But we have to look obviously at the threat assessment globally, and particularly focus on the governmental and intergovernmental best practices strategies to reduce the risks. So what I would like to do first is to introduce our distinguished panel according to the program that you have before you. First speaker, and I'll come back to him, Dr. Rafi Grigoryan, who is deputy to the Undersecretary General, Director of the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism. The next speaker, Thomas Berezovsky, who is a counsel to the domestic terrorism in the counterterrorism section of the U.S. Department of Justice, will join us a little bit later on due to a schedule issue, but he will come on later on. And then our colleague Oliver Buck-Revel, the former associate deputy director of the FBI, as well as captain of the U.S. Marine Corps. And then our colleague, Professor Rita Caldwell, the distinguished university professor at Maryland and Johns Hopkins, and senior fellow at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. We're very pleased also to have Dr. Ivan Anchev, a former Bulgarian diplomat, who is joining us from Sofia, and it will focus on terrorism and law enforcement issues. And then, of course, Ambassador Charlie Ray, our colleague, former U.S. ambassador in Asia and Africa, and also Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for POW, missing personnel affairs at the Pentagon and all that. And surely we are waiting to hear from General Gray later on. So I would like to move on in one second, but if I may just mention a little historical footnote that I think is relevant to our discussion today, because today, January 20th, if we look at the calendar and we look at the historical record, it is basically the 41st year's anniversary when 52 U.S. embassy hostages were seized by Iran November 1979, were released finally after 444 days. So really the question that we have to ask ourselves, can we learn from history? And what are we going to learn? Is the worst yet to come? Can we learn that the civilization will survive? So these are some of the issues that I think we can discuss. Obviously, we cannot cover every important issue, but we would like to move on according to our program and to ask our colleague, Dr. Buffy Grigorian, as I mentioned, his title at the United Nations. He worked in many capacities, academic and diplomatic and military as well, on counterterrorism and international peace security issues for many years. And prior to joining the United Nations, he was director of multilateral affairs in the Bureau of Counterterrorism of the United States Department of State. And he had many positions at the State Department and very senior missions that he had over the years. And particularly it comes to mind his contribution to the conflict in the Balkans, the issue of Bosnia and Kosovo, and so on. And he provided also advice to NATO and elsewhere. I would like to mention also his academic, I think, contributions of many of the years. And he received his doctorate from Johns Hopkins University, and also some other degrees, master's degrees, also from King's College in London, as well as studying at the University of Pennsylvania, and he majored in history. So he can provide also interdisciplinary perspective, and he published extensively. I think we have a slide of one of his books and his contribution to our studies on NATO. So, Rafi, it's all yours.
Thank you, Yona. I hope everyone can hear me. That's the typical greeting in the Zoom environment, I think, right? Anyway, Happy New Year to you, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I'm very pleased to join you for this discussion, and I thank the Inter-University Center for Terrorist Studies for the invitation. Last year, we marked the somber 20th anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks and opened what many feel is a new chapter in the fight against terrorism, a fight that we will have to take forward in a very different strategic, geopolitical, and technological environment impacted by climate change, pandemics, and interstate competition in a fragmented world. The fight against terrorism has seen significant successes in the past 2 decades, though. Hundreds of terrorist attacks were foiled, many unbeknownst to the public. Terrorist leaders were neutralized, including the founders of Al-Qaeda and Daesh. Cells were disrupted and their operational space squeezed through unprecedented international action spurred by the Security Council. We confronted the largest wave of foreign terrorist fighters in modern times and brought about the territorial defeat of Daesh in Iraq and Syria. Yet, despite these successes, thousands more lives have been lost to terrorism and too many are still at risk. Besides physical destruction, terrorism has sown division, fear, and trauma in our societies. Sometimes the pursuit of security has resulted in disproportionate and even unnecessary restrictions being placed on fundamental freedoms and human rights. So we should be approaching the new decade not just with continued determination, but also humility and a desire to do better. 2021 has shown that the terrorism threat landscape has become geographically more diffuse, ideologically more diverse, and tactically more varied. It is set to evolve further under the impact of transformative technologies as member states, UN entities, international and regional organizations, civil society, and private sector partners discussed during the second Counterterrorism Week organized by UNOCT last June. Daesh and Al-Qaeda remain the top global threats, from guerrilla campaigns in and near conflict zones to the potential for lone individuals inspired online, acting with varying degrees of planning and sophistication. The group's expansion in many subregions of Africa continued, spreading from the Sahel to the Gulf of Guinea, taking further hold in Central and Southern Africa, including Mozambique, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and now threatening Uganda. All the while, al-Shabaab continued to pose a protracted threat to Somalia and its neighbors. The Taliban's takeover in Afghanistan in August has been widely perceived as a moral boost for terrorists and violent extremists. Some even see it as a vindication of strategic patience in the face of national authorities whose will and capacity to fight is undermined by corruption and waning popular support, while international partners rethink their approaches. Despite their assurances, there is no sign that the Taliban are taking action to sever their links with Al-Qaeda or that they can effectively, let alone durably, counter the kind of terrorist insurgency they themselves waged for years. ISIL Khorasan province, the local Daesh affiliate, has already doubled in size in the country and has pinned its hopes on further chaos and disaffection, including among Taliban fighters. From these unpredictable situations arise a short to mid-term risk for neighboring countries, which UNOCT supports through regional capacity building programs, for instance, in Central Asia. But there is a significant risk also that terrorists could gain safe havens to resume external operations. This will compound the immediate threat posed by online terrorist radicalization, homegrown terrorism, and recidivism outside conflict zones, where COVID-19 related restrictions have continued for now to keep a lid on terrorist operations. Member states, therefore, must stand united and committed to supporting each other as the threat can quickly spread far beyond any given national border. So as we start 2022 and a new decade of counterterrorism, let me highlight a few key trends and related policy priorities to adjust our responses and collaboration at the international, regional, and domestic levels. The General Assembly's 7th and most forward-looking review resolution of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy, adopted last June, provides important guidance in this regard and a clear roadmap for UNOCT and our UN Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact of 42 UN and partner entities to support our member states. First, growing discontent and polarization and the spread of conspiracy theories and hate speech have widened the pool of individuals susceptible to being mobilized for violence. Sometimes government measures have played into these dynamics by violating human rights and the rule of law, including in the name of counterterrorism. This trend preceded the pandemic, but fractures in society have widened and become glaring. Millions of people have lost livelihoods, hope, and support. Millions, especially youth, spend more time online, increasingly exposed to predators and harmful content. Secretary General Antonio Guterres has warned we are facing a breakdown of truth, trust, and values. The fabric of societies needs to be mended, and the social contract between people and their governments needs to be renewed. Peace building, or winning hearts and minds of populations targeted by terrorist insurgencies, is essential to build resilience to terrorism. This imperative was already established with the General Assembly's adoption by consensus of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy in 2006, which called for addressing the conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism, and expanded on it through the Secretary General's Plan of Action to Prevent Violent Extremism of December 2015. General Assembly negotiations for the 7th Strategy Review that I just mentioned reflected growing ownership of the prevention agenda, and the outcome language underlines the need to build inclusive and accountable institutions to promote pluralism, tolerance, and interreligious and intercultural dialogue, and to address hate speech and to counter incitement to hostility, hatred, and violence. It is clear that these issues are much larger than terrorism and should be addressed in their own right. And many of our UN partners, such as the UN Development Program, UNESCO, or the Alliance of Civilizations, may often have the primary role. But terrorism is a reminder of what can happen when inclusivity and accountability are ignored, and UNOCT will continue to engage and offer support to member states under its global Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism program, including for policy development, strategic communications, and youth empowerment. Similar dynamics have been at play in fueling the appeal and replenishing the ranks of Al-Qaeda and Daesh, but also in driving the rise in terrorist attacks on the basis of xenophobia, racism, and other forms of intolerance, or in the name of religion or belief, better known in the United States as racially and ethically motivated violent extremism, or REMV. UNOCT is preparing a report of the Secretary General to be issued in September on this growing concern for many member states, especially in North America, Europe, and Oceania, and its transnational dimensions. Our programs are designed to address terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, consistent with the international legal and policy framework against terrorism. So we are looking at how we can tailor our efforts to support member states requesting assistance against this scourge. Second, the growing interplay between terrorism, weak governance, armed conflict, and organized crime adds complexity to an already difficult challenge. Terrorists exploit and actively instigate the power vacuum that state fragility creates, undermining state legitimacy even further. They cause humanitarian crises, hamper humanitarian assistance, and can be spoilers in peace efforts. The reality on the ground is increasingly blurred. This growing entanglement destroys the rule of law, suppresses human rights, entrenches corruption, and impedes sustainable development. Yet we cannot simply conflate these challenges. They each require appropriate instruments, the right amount of attention, and counterterrorism needs to be integrated as part of sophisticated and comprehensive responses. Last September, Secretary General Guterres issued his landmark report on Our Common Agenda, suggesting a way forward to implement the political declaration adopted by member states for the UN's 75th anniversary. He called for the development of a new agenda for peace, noting that protracted conflicts are often associated with terrorism, which is one of the strategic risks facing the international community. Fragile and conflict-affected member states need comprehensive packages of advice and support, including counterterrorism as but one element, to build in a sustainable fashion their own capacities to deliver security and other basic services for their people. In this vein, UNOCT has continued to strengthen its presence in the field to be closer to its beneficiaries and its partners from peace operations, UN country teams, and regional organizations. Last year, we opened a regional program office in Rabat, Morocco, and we will soon open one in Nairobi, Kenya. Third, new and emerging technologies are rapidly impacting terrorism and counterterrorism. They create new threat vectors and new vulnerabilities to cybercrime and attacks. All the while, it is becoming increasingly easier for terrorist groups to access these skills and capacities. Member states are all challenged to keep up, let alone proactively anticipate and prevent the use of new technologies for terrorist and other criminal purposes. Cooperation, including with the private sector and civil society, is a prerequisite to maximize the benefits of new technologies, ensure they are harnessed responsibly, and prevent their criminal misuse. UNOCT is prioritizing technology in its own operations and in our support to member states. We are working with our partners, including the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, and Interpol, as well as others, on building state capacity to conduct online investigations, to respond to terrorist attack against critical infrastructure, to use advanced passenger information and passenger name record data to counter terrorist travel, to use biometrics responsibly, to counter the threat from drones to vulnerable targets, or to prevent and respond to terrorist use of chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear materials. This year, we are looking to strengthen our focus on the use of virtual assets and cryptocurrencies for terrorism financing, and following a first excellent expert roundtable in December to address the intersection of violent extremism with digital online gaming spaces and their adjacent platforms. Fourth, we need to anchor counterterrorism back into the rule of law and human rights. The reason is simple. Disregarding the rule of law fosters impunity, and failure to protect and promote human rights, especially human rights violations committed by security forces, gives terrorist recruitment tools for free. The 7th strategy review resulted in significant advances on human rights, including gender equality, the rights of the child and victims of terrorism, and mitigating the impact of counterterrorism measures on civil society and principled humanitarian action. Applying a gender lens is key as terrorists strategically manipulate gender stereotypes to recruit. Misogyny permeates terrorist ideologies and tactics, and terrorism and counterterrorism alike impact women and girls differently and often disproportionately. UNOCT has taken these priorities to heart since its establishment, and we have now built a dedicated human rights and gender section reporting directly to me. This year, we will organize with Spain a high-level conference to follow up on the virtual dialogue we held with human rights and civil society partners in the run-up to the strategy review, and we will convene the first global Congress of Victims of Terrorism later this year. Urging member states to repatriate their nationals in camps and detention facilities in northeast Syria will also remain a key priority in 2022 for the UN system at the intersection of counterterrorism, humanitarian action, and human rights. The pace of repatriation from northeast Syria remains slow. Leaving the people there stranded brings neither security nor accountability, nor does it respect the rights of thousands of children who should not be punished for their parents' crimes. In 2022, we will continue rolling out with our partners coordinated support to requesting member states, including through a global framework that we launched in September under the auspices of the Secretary General. Helping member states overcome screening and prosecutorial challenges will help address security concerns and public reluctance, and should be a priority. I want to pay tribute to the excellent work of the UN investigative team to promote accountability for crimes committed by Daesh, or UNITAD as it's known, which is currently engaged with 12 member states. We also welcome the new language adopted by the Security Council on battlefield evidence in its Resolution 2617 passed last month, which encourages CTED to facilitate the provision of assistance by relevant entities, including UNODC and ourselves, to develop related strategies. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, we have learned the hard way over the past 2 decades that there are no quick fixes, and counterterrorism is a long game in which we cannot afford leaving any country or our principles and values behind. In 2022, we have an opportunity to start a course correction to live up to the global counterterrorism strategy and the UN Charter. You can count on the UN system and UNOCT in particular to continue bringing member states together, facilitating dialogue, and providing tailored support. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rafi, for your presentation. Obviously, if you're available to stay for a while, we will try to encourage some questions and answers session. So if there are any questions at this point from our colleagues, briefly for Rafi. If not, may I ask you one question in terms of the role of the UN specialized agencies and in terms of coordination with the United Nations headquarters?
Sorry, what's the question?
My question was if you could perhaps briefly clarify the relationships between the UN headquarters activities, General Assembly, and the specialized agencies. For example, the ICAO in terms of airport security and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yes, certainly. Let me give you a very concrete example. So in December 2017, the United Nations Security Council, with the United States taking the pen, as we say, adopted a resolution, number 2396, about addressing concerns connected to the foreign terrorist fighter phenomenon. Particular concern was many of them having gone to the conflict zones. The focus was now on them coming back and the kinds of attacks they commit back in their home countries or third countries that they travel to. So the Security Council obliged all member states under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter that they must adopt and use advanced passenger information and passenger name record data together with biometrics and watch lists. At that point, probably about 30 countries in the world did that. So we went, from 23 to 193 being the requirement. Then my office set up a program called CT Travel Program to help countries do just that. The ones other than the ones that had already done it. We got software from a member state, the Netherlands, that they donated it to us. And then we put together a consortium of UN entities to include UN Office of Drugs and Crime, the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and the Office of Information and Communications Technology, together with Interpol and now additional partners, IOM and OSCE and others, to help member states put in place the legislation in compliance with human rights protections, to establish and train passenger information units to use this data that would come in from air travel to be able to detect the movement of terrorists, and then to give them the software and the hardware and the training to use all of it. Right now, we have 49 member states have signed up for that program, and we already have gone live in a pilot project in the 15 countries of the Caribbean community. And what this does is allow countries to share information about the movement of known and suspected terrorists and to be able to focus their resources in the best possible way on the highest possible threat. So that, as you can see, it involves a wide array of actors, as well as member states working together with the Security Council and the General Assembly. So that's probably the best example I can give you to illustrate the way we work today on countering terrorism at the UN.
Yonah, may I ask Mr. Grigorian a question?
Sure.
How operational is you? I mean, if you get involved in operations, let me give you the recent example of the British subject who appears in Texas and takes some hostages. Apparently, the British had a great deal of information about him. I don't know how much information we had in the United States, but just taking that as an example, would your office be involved at all in operations, or are you more at a higher level of creating institutions and practices?
It's a little bit more of the latter. There are some exceptions to that, of course. For example, where we have forces operating under the UN flag, such as in Mali or Democratic Republic of Congo, where we the UN flagged forces do come into contact with Al Qaeda and ISIL, for example, then there's an clear operational nexus. But on these bilateral, multilateral issues between states, in this case the UK and the US, as you mentioned, they have their own channels for doing that. But what we do provide, for example, in that counterterrorism travel program that I described to you, we set up the mechanisms that allow member states to communicate with each other on these matters. So we don't hold the data. That's very important to know. The UN doesn't hold data on the known and suspected terrorists, but they facilitate the exchange of that information among member states to do that. So in that sense, we're operational, but we don't get involved in the individual cases of information.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, we will come back to you, I'm sure, with some other questions. If I may, I would like to continue to invite our colleagues. The next speaker is Oliver Buck-Revell. We were delighted to have him last month at our program on the role of law enforcement. And as I mentioned before, his work at the FBI for many years, and as well as his relationship with the military, experience in military, particularly U.S. Marine Corps. And for many years, he was involved in many activities as a senior, I think, official, the FBI, and many of the operations over the year. For example, he was involved in Los Angeles as the commander of a joint federal law enforcement effort to suppress the riots and civil disorder and so on. So he retired with the rank of Associate Deputy Director, and he received many awards from U.S. government presidents like President George H.W. Bush, as well as secretaries of state and so on. And also he contributed a great deal to the private sector and the academic community, and the work with many organizations in the United States and also internationally. So obviously we would welcome his presentation, and I know that I have a question later on related, of course, to the hostage situation in Texas, but at any rate, please make your presentation at this time.
Well, I'm pleased to be back with you again, Professor, and all of the distinguished lecturers you have here. You were mentioning, and I want to use it as an example of the unique issues that we face in law enforcement in the United States in dealing with terrorism, both domestically and internationally. The situation here in Dallas, and I am in Dallas, actually in the DFW area, where we had Malik Akram taking hostages in a synagogue in our area, brought forward a number of the concerns and issues that I think are relevant to where we stand on the whole capability to counter terrorism under law, to deal with terrorism within the structure of our constitutional and regulatory rights. That is the responsibility of course, the FBI, but essentially all law enforcement. Malik Akram was not known in this country. He had not been featured on any sort of joint communication or any sort of information submitted to the United States. And there's no indication that he should have been until, of course, his arrival here He flew into New York, and then he came to Dallas, stayed in 2 or 3 overnight shelter locations, and then was dropped off at the synagogue, and at that point was allowed to enter the synagogue, and at that then indicated to them that he wanted to pray with them, and then not long after that he pulled his weapon, a semi-automatic pistol, and indicated he was there for more than just prayer. He made an immediate declaration that he wanted to obtain an exchange or a release of the woman who is known as Lady Al-Qaeda, and that he did not expect to return home, that he expected to die during this process. Now, that particular statement obviously put this whole issue in a different context. It became tactical right up front. That doesn't mean they're going to rush in the door, but they knew they had to deal with a very grave issue, threatening the 4 worshipers in the synagogue, but also the possibility of his having perhaps other contacts in the area that could cause difficulties in the process. The Colleyville police responded immediately, and fortunately, the ongoing activities in the synagogue allowed there to be a wide community of knowledge, because it was an ongoing, not festival, but ongoing presentation in the synagogue, and so the inner and activities of Akram were known very widely by this closed circuit television process, probably a Zoom conference like we're having. And then the Colleyville police were on the scene within 3 to 4 minutes. They had been well schooled in hostage situations. They set up a perimeter, they established communications, they did the things that they're supposed to do. And then they reached out to the FBI and other agencies, including the Texas Department of Justice, and also ATF came in as part of the Joint Terrorism Task Force here in the Dallas area. The demand for the release of the female prisoner in the Fort Worth Medical Center, which is a Bureau of Prisons facility, ramped the thing up to the point where immediately they knew that they were not going to be able to meet any of his demands. So there was a determination that if he held to his word, this was likely going to end up in a rather traumatic close. And the greatest concern on the part of the Colleyville police chief and the agent in charge of the FBI was to obtain the release of the hostages with the minimum possible violence. However, during the ongoing negotiations, he called a colleague, a friend back in the UK, and laid out what he was doing and why he was doing it, and kept saying, "And I shall not return except in a body bag, and that I'm carrying out the wishes of Allah," and so forth. So they knew from the outset that he had no plans on surrendering or returning to the United Kingdom, that he was there to carry out a jihadi attack, and that the synagogue became a important connection. He wasn't attacking the synagogue per se. He was using the synagogue in order to reach the American government to obtain the release of his. We don't think there was any connection between them except his respect for her and her role as a leading female jihadist in the world, and was also on the FBI's top terrorist wanted list before she was apprehended in a firefight in Afghanistan, in which she wounded American personnel, and was later tried in New York and sentenced to 80 80-something years, of which she's still in the early stages of serving. The negotiation went on for some time, and during this, the agent in charge here in Dallas called back to Washington and got the hostage rescue team actually deployed here to Dallas. And they were able to do that in 4 hours. And that is a very remarkable return, because the HRT is located at Quantico, and they can't fly out of Quantico, so they have to fly out of, in this case, I think it was Dulles. And they flew in military aircraft, and then were deployed with vehicles to the synagogue, and immediately took up the inner perimeter on the location, and then interacted, of course, with the Colleyville police, the FBI agent in charge, and so forth. The FBI's local office was conducting most of the dialogue with him during the process of the outcome, or the event. But there was participation also by a Colleyville officer, and that was helpful. When the HRT arrived, the hostage negotiators started directly briefing them on what was going on, so they would have a complete picture. Well, as this went forward for over 11 hours, there was a continuous dialogue, and it was noted that he was becoming much more aggressive. His speech and his threats were becoming very specific. So just as they had arrived at the point that they were going to have to do a dynamic entry, the door sprang open, and out came two of the parishioner, or the participants in the synagogue's activities, two members of the synagogue, and followed by a man that turned out to have been a key to this release or escape, because the rabbi had picked up a chair and thrown it at Akram to gain their immediate escape. Fortunately, the HRT was right there to take the detainees in protective care and remove them from the scene. And then the HRT made a dynamic entry into the facility, into the synagogue, where, again, Akram lived up to his promise and attempted to fight his way out and was killed. The agent in charge made a tactical mistake in very good faith after the event, because there was tremendous press interest, not only here in Texas, but throughout the United States, and obviously in the UK as well. And he made a statement which was factually true, but incorrect in the context. He said that there was no indication or evidence that this was an attack against the Jewish faith or the synagogue. He had other objectives. Well, the only demands he made were for the release of the female prisoner. But the very fact that he had done it so by taking hostages in the synagogue should have led the SAC to say, but there is an obvious connection here with the jihadist activity, and that is being pursued. And it, of course, was being pursued. Now, during this time, they were in touch at the scene and through FBI headquarters with the British authorities, particularly MI5. And it was determined that Akram was known to them, but was not on any watch list. They had brought him in for questioning, as they can do in the UK. He had been considered a potential threat in the future, but not at the time, and was never carried on their terrorist threat list, and no information on him was conveyed to the United States. Now, there is no visa required between the UK and the United States, but there is an information form and a certificate that's granted through a kiosk type situation that you have to enter in and show your have your passport copied, and it's put on a small certificate that you carry with you in lieu of a visa. But that did not include any information about this trip that was conveyed to authorities because there was no warning flags of his potential terrorist status. The phone calls he made are very interesting, and there'll be an assessment and a release on that would pertain to threat assessments for other circumstances. He was born in Pakistan, migrated, as many Pakistanis do because of being a Commonwealth country, to the UK, had been there for some time, had family there, and his activities relating to becoming an extremist emanated from the UK, not from the United States, nor was he frequently in Pakistan, although he had been back on a couple of occasions. So whatever activities led him to his radicalization would have been in the UK, and there'll be very significant interest on their part in following up to see what it might mean for their procedures and their intelligence collection process. As far as the tactical result here, it was exceptionally good. The Colleyville Police, the task force, JTTF, they came in and did what they needed to do very quickly, and there were no outside casualties. And the only casualty was the subject, who made it plain he wouldn't be taken back except in a body bag, and he lived up to that expectation. I think that this particular circumstance, because it involved a foreign individual flying into the United States, coming from New York to Texas, having a specific objective and target, and had already made the decision that he was not going to return, that this would be his final act as a jihadi to carry out this action. I think it points to one of the issues we have on domestic. We have 19,000 police departments. We've got over 50 state agencies. We have several federal agencies. And how do you facilitate not just an action like this, but the coordination of intelligence and joint planning to be prepared to resolve those instances without any unnecessary bloodshed. I think it also is important to realize that there is a stream of activity going through otherwise friendly nations that would be of great concern, or should be of great concern, to those of us in the United States that, in my case, had, and in their case, have, to protect the citizens and personnel in the United States. The mention of the United Nations, very frankly, during my tenure in Washington, we had some interest with the United Nations on several things, but not terrorism. It was an area where, very frankly, we were concerned about intelligence sharing because, after all, the United Nations has some 200 countries, and several of them are very hostile to us. And so the way that you would share classified information has to be very precise and very focused, and not generally available throughout the membership. And we'd gone through the same sort of approach with Interpol, which also has virtually the same cast, and including several that are state sponsors of terrorism or use terrorism in their own policy and activity. On the assessment of what's going on in the United States today, I think the one area that hasn't gotten sufficient attention is the threat we face from Iran, particularly in view of their open pledge, which is rebroadcast virtually every day in some form, to retaliate and take revenge for the killing of Soleimani. He was the commander of their Revolutionary Guard and one of the most capable and cold-blooded terrorists in the world. But he had the Quds Force and a number of other capabilities that gave him extreme lethality in his ongoing activities, including attacks and planned attacks in Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and other locations where they felt that they were too close to the United States or any U.S. facilities in the area. I particularly think that we will hear from Iran, not in the Middle East, but on some sort of action here in the United States within a year, because they have pledged openly to do so. I've read several reports from MEMRI, Middle East Media Research Institute, which specifically outlines the commitment of Iran to take revenge against the great state in the United States, and to do so in the United States within this year. And I think we'd be very foolish not to take them at their word, because they have the means and the resources and the capabilities of causing great harm. And if we're not careful and focus on that, their activity and the ongoing circumstances in the Middle East, it could come back to haunt us. Now, naturally, Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, those elements are still there. The breakdown of any sort of control in Afghanistan has released capabilities by very substantial organizations that now have all the munitions and technology they need to carry out significant attacks virtually anywhere in the world. That's a complicating factor for law enforcement. And part of the FBI's responsibility is to acquire and disseminate as much of that information as possible to the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, of which there are now some 200. I can't give you a figure on the number of police officers and other agencies involved, but let's say that it is essentially 100% meet the FBI's commitment, and the FBI has all 56 field officers with task forces, and then we have 200 total, including task forces in resident agency locations. The JTTF is the means by which the FBI not only conducts investigations, but also takes any sort of action. And the ultimate capability we have in the country for is the deployment of HRT to a particular scene. It doesn't have to be a hostage situation. It could be a situation where, for instance, we had when the Cuban prisoners were causing great difficulties in the United States in the federal prison, where they were those that had been convicted of crimes and charged and so forth were in federal prisons. And we had a breakdown of two prisons, one in Louisiana and one in Atlanta, where they took hostages and were ready to kill, literally. The HRT was dispatched to Louisiana because it occurred first. And prisons are as hard to break into as they are to break out of, because they were able to set up lockdowns and barricades to keep the law enforcement authorities out. So I asked for the first time for the deployment of military personnel, in this case Delta, to Atlanta, and the first domestic deployment in a real-time circumstance of Delta was to the Atlanta federal prison for putting down the riot and protecting and rescuing the staff that had been held hostage in the prison. In that circumstance, there was only the U.S. government involved, but it did include the cooperation of 3 different entities, obviously the Bureau of Prisons, obviously the FBI, but then also the Department of Defense through the commitment of the Delta. And that was the very first time that they had been deployed in a domestic law enforcement situation, and they performed very admirably. We have done the same thing with major events. We have asked for support from DOD at the Olympics and at other special events activities where the HRT and the regional SWATs and the office SWATs can carry out a number of activities, but they don't have the mass to meet all of the contentious situations that may arise. So it's very important to have a smooth link between that capability. I saw where they mentioned the LA riots. For the first time, a federal officer had been put in control of multiple federal agencies, and then with oversight over the military deployment. That person happened to be me, and that was an interesting scenario because I had about 800 federal agents of law enforcement, and then we had the California National Guard, Mountain Division, and the Marine 1st Division had units there. We had about 14,000 military. So obviously my points of coordination became very active in making sure we were working at in conjunction with the LA and LAPD and the LA Sheriff's Office, which we did. But the world we live in today is going to require very flexible and fluid tactical responses. But on the intelligence side, it has to be much more specific to those that are carrying out an event or an activity that they have let you know, because it's going to be in their own internal propaganda, which is monitored both by government and by private sector entities. And those have to be carefully considered because they do indicate when there's going to be activities. Now, domestically, it's a different issue. We don't have the same sort of latitude in dealing with the domestic issue that you do perhaps at the international level. Free speech, the First Amendment, is obviously one of the cardinal rules for our society. People can get up and say awful things, and they do every day. The internet is a propaganda tool as well as a planning and operational control mechanism for domestic terrorists as well as international terrorists. So the process of becoming aware of and monitoring the ongoing traffic on the internet, including the blacknet, becomes a very important strategic approach to trying to be prepared to react and to do so within the pre-planned utilization of personnel that are properly trained and equipped to deal with the situation. That situation may be a hostage or a bombing or an arrest, but you have to have the significant variables so that you can deal with any of those situations. The intelligence collection, if you're dealing with a foreign terrorist organization, you reach the point of needing a wire intercept, that comes under the FISA statute. If it's a domestic group, you need a wiretap, that comes under the standard rules and policy for obtaining wiretaps under federal law enforcement. So you have to differentiate under the guidelines. There are different guidelines for dealing with domestic as opposed to international. They're all handled within the same division, but they have separate components that deal specifically with those responsibilities. I think at this point, I'll just like to drop back, and then if there's questions or discussion at the end, step in with anything that I might have of relevance.
Thank you very much, Bob, for covering both the domestic and the international dimension. I'm sure that our colleagues will have some questions for you later on. If we may move to our other speakers, I would like to invite our colleague, Professor Rita Caldwell. As I mentioned before, she is a distinguished university professor at Maryland and Johns Hopkins University and the senior fellow at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. And we are very proud to collaborate over the years, and particularly the past 2 years in the shadow of the pandemic. And I think this would be a good time to look at the annual threat assessment amid the COVID-19 pandemic in 2021. And we would like to invite her. I understand she has a PowerPoint, and she published many studies and books, and we try to develop about 15 events and published probably about 10 reports on this issue. So, Rita, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Yona. Can we have the next slide? I'm going to go through these rather quickly. I'm going to focus on bioterrorism. It's a global threat. We know that from what Mother Nature, at least the evidence seems most strongly for Mother Nature, having brought us the COVID pandemic. Now the next slide. What I'd like to focus on is that disease agents have been listed, at least for the last 5 or 6 years, as potential bioterror threats. We now categorize the bio threats according to their capability for disrupting society and being highly contagious. Bacteria, viruses, toxins. Those are the category A agents. The category B are the ones that are easily disseminated. They cause moderate illness rates, but they can disrupt societies. These are the bacteria that cause things like brucellosis and food safety and water safety threats. We have the next slide, please. The types of agents that have been declared as bio threats are those that pose a severe threat to public health and safety. And as I've said, these are categories A, B, or C. The laboratories which may use or study these agents have similar categorization. Have the next slide, please. The category A agents are the ones that are easily transmitted. They're disseminated with very high mortality, with major public health impact. May I have the next slide, please? And a good example is the viral hemorrhagic fever, which causes these symptoms and is severely debilitating. May I have the next slide? The similar is smallpox. Now, this is probably the only agent that has been effectively eliminated. That is, there now are just 2 sources of smallpox. One is a lab in Russia and the other is in the US. These are under tight control. And smallpox has the vaccines to smallpox, or at least immunization, is no longer done. Hence, we do have a totally global susceptibility population because of the fact that we do no longer vaccinate against smallpox. May I have the next slide, please? Category B agents are those that are relatively easy to disseminate with low mortality rates, but nevertheless can incapacitate a country, a population. May I have the next slide, please? Q fever is an example. the source is contaminated animals and disseminated via contaminated dust. And have the next slide, please. Category C agents are the emerging pathogens that can be engineered for mass dissemination. They're relatively available, can be easily produced and disseminated with a high mortality rate or the ability to cause a major health impact. May I have the next slide, please? This is an example. That's the hantavirus. And in the Southwest, this virus is appears periodically, and we do have cases each year. It's a pulmonary symptomatology. May I have the next slide, please? The H1N1, we have outbreaks periodically from nature, but it's an agent that can be a category B biothreat if it were to be developed. May I have the next slide, please? Now, we've had SARS outbreak that we were able to control. This occurred some years ago, but it's a member of the Coronaviridae family, a virus family, a group of viruses of which SARS-CoV-2 is currently in pandemic form, of which we are all thoroughly aware. May I have the next slide, please? It's been argued that rational state actors would never use biological weapons offensively. The argument was that biological weapons can't really be controlled. It would backfire. It would harm the army on the offensive with worse effects than the target of the biothreat. An agent like smallpox or airborne viruses would spread worldwide. We know this now. COVID-19 clearly demonstrates what happens if an agent is not properly, fully controlled. May I have the next slide, please? So modern biowarfare has not been demonstrated except through, at the present time, Mother Nature. But its capability is to be anti-personnel, anti-agriculture, livestock, and even a potential for entomological, that is, insect warfare. May I have the next slide? Anti-personnel means that it's highly infective, virulent. No vaccines are available. Fortunately, we were able to develop, based on 20 years of research that had been ongoing, we have now vaccines, and we're able to protect against the COVID-2. Now, for this kind of weaponized agent, that is, if we have a Class A agent, can retain infectivity and virulence after a long period of storage, and it can be a military agent. The primary difficulty isn't the production of the agent, because many biological agents that are used or can be used as weapons can be manufactured pretty quickly, cheaply, and easily. But it's understanding the vulnerable target that that poses the hurdle for an agent to be employed. Now, the next slide, please. What can be, again, a bioweapon, and it's subtle and it's lethal because it isn't observed so directly on the population as, for example, SARS and SARS-CoV-2. An anti-agricultural agent would destroy crops, and during the Cold War, plant diseases were considered to be a way of destroying agriculture. Now, biological weapons also can target fisheries, water-based vegetation, and destruction of enemy agriculture on a strategic scale at some point during the Cold War was considered to be a Sino-Soviet aggressive biothreat. May I have the next slide, please? Diseases like wheat blast and rice blast have been weaponized, or at least they've been considered as a weapon for delivering to agricultural regions. The U.S. renounced offensive biological warfare in 1969 and 70, and the vast majority of the biological arsenal was really plant diseases. May I have the next slide, please? Now, herbicides are chemicals, but they have been grouped with biological warfare and chemical warfare because they work similarly to toxins and bioregulators. Now, biological warfare can also specifically target plants to destroy crops or defoliate vegetation. The US and Britain discovered plant growth regulators, herbicides, during the Second World War, and initiated a herbicidal warfare program that was used in Malaya and Vietnam in counterinsurgency operations. May I have the next slide, please? Anti-livestock really involve variants of foot and mouth disease, rinderpest against cows, and African swine fever for pigs, and psittacosis to kill chickens. These agents can be sprayed either from tanks or attached to airplanes over hundreds of miles. During the Mau Mau uprising in 1952, the poisonous latex of the African milk bush was used to kill cattle. Have the next slide, please. Entomological warfare is a kind of biological warfare that uses insects to attack the enemy. The concept is a very old one. It's been used for centuries in primitive times, Middle Ages, and continued into the modern era. Entomological warfare has been used in battle by Japan, and several other nations have developed and been accused of using an entomological warfare program. This employs insects in a direct attack or as vectors to deliver a biological agent like plague. Have the next slide, please. Essentially, entomological warfare exists in three varieties. One is you infect the insects with a pathogen and disperse it. The insect then is a vector infecting people or animals that they bite. Another is direct insect attack against crops. Now, the insect may not be infected with a pathogen, but it does represent a threat to agriculture. And then there's always uninfected insects like bees and wasps that are used to directly attack the enemy. Now, the next slide, please. So we have to consider bio threats in the future, and we must develop ways of preventing and protecting against biothreats. May I have the next slide, please? And planning involves developing the ability to identify rapidly, if not immediately, a biothreat agent. Unfortunately, we've had cutbacks to the budgets of public health agencies, and this has limited the tracking of disease outbreaks. And we've had some outbreaks, such as food poisoning due to E. coli or salmonella, that could be either natural or deliberate. This is one notorious example that occurred in Oregon some years ago, where the salad counter in a restaurant was contaminated directly to interfere with an election. Biodefense protects against bioterrorism, and investment is clearly important in biodefense. May I have the next slide, please? So biodefense refers to measures to restore biosecurity, and it's discussed in the context of biowar or bioterrorism, and it's generally considered a military or emergency response. But nevertheless, there are two target populations: the civilian and the military, the troops in the field. And protection really is that of water supplies and food supplies, and very critical. May I have the next slide, please? So there are specific types of preparedness: personal preparedness, healthcare, state and local, and national preparedness, but also legal, in that making it possible to respond to a bio threat legally and effectively. May I have the next slide, please? Unfortunately, in the 21st century, in 2022 and in the future, I think we have to consider another type of bioterrorism. That is, because there is a psychology associated with a pandemic. We're living it with COVID-2. Following a pandemic or during a pandemic, there's fear, panic, and there's every range of human emotion, from horror, anger, panic, concerns about infection that may be unrealistic, but possibly realistic, and of course, always the fear of contagion. And we're in the midst of dealing with the pandemic, social isolation, and demoralization. May I have the next slide, please? In 1918, the influenza, the COVID virus, caused 33 more plus deaths. We are dealing with about 5 million total global deaths as of yesterday. That's the latest number, with about 300 plus thousand cases globally. In the US, we're approaching 1 million deaths and 67 million cases. May I have the next slide, please? We definitely need a global alert and response system. We need to understand that biothreat no longer is contained to a single locale. It is, in fact, a global issue, a global danger, and that we must take the time and the effort and the energy to develop a global system and a global response system. We are working toward that with the current COVID pandemic, in understanding that we cannot just vaccinate US citizens. We must share the vaccine, and we must vaccinate globally. And I think what we have learned during the COVID pandemic, we need to understand in terms of what a biothreat in the future of another agent can do, not just to an enemy, be it a local unit, a country, but it will end up being global. So this is, I think, a kind of rudimentary and all too familiar presentation of what bioterrorism means and involves. But I think we need to understand that this kind of biothreat remains in the future for us as a nation, but us as a global society. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the comprehensive presentation of the bio threat and for your many contributions over the years to restore the public confidence and trust in science, and also the role of the media, the educational approach, your approach of interdisciplinary examination. I don't know if our colleagues have any particular question at this point. So before we move on to our next speaker, and then we'll develop the Q&A discussion. If not, in the interest of time, I would like to invite Dr. Ivan Anchev from Sofia, Bulgaria, who joined us. We're grateful to him for his participation in our academic work over the years. I think about a dozen years that he spent in the United States as a representative of Bulgaria in the embassy, and then his responsibility was not only in the US, not only in Washington, D.C., and the latest post he had the Consulate General of Bulgaria in Chicago. And as we know, the Bulgarian diaspora outside Bulgaria, the largest one, is in the United States. At any rate, he participated in the counterterrorism area and combating organized crime for many, many years, highly decorated. And academically, he received his PhD dealing with Islamic radicalism as a threat to national security and so on. Also, he graduated from the FBI National Academy in Quantico, and he received also other degrees in Bulgaria. So now he returned to Bulgaria to continue with his important work. Ivan?
Thank you, Professor Alexander. It's a great pleasure to see you again, to say good evening from Bulgaria, because it's 10:26 p.m. right now in Bulgaria. But it's my pleasure really to get together with you, dear Professor, because we had a great cooperation during my term in Washington, D.C. And I am extremely glad that we are able to get together again, even from the both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Before I start my short comment, I would like to present that I left Bulgarian government 1 year ago. Next comments are my personal comments, and they are not connected and related with the Bulgarian government. Now, I'm a person who is out of the Bulgarian government structure. I will start with the regional framework in the region, and I'm gonna talk predominantly for the hybrid and asymmetric operations on the Balkans right now, because the situation not only on the Balkans but also in the region, you know, the tensions around Ukraine are really difficult at this moment, and it's tough to live here with such neighbors. Speaking more geopolitically. Of Bulgaria's 5 neighboring countries, 4 are members of NATO. This is Greece, the Republic of North Macedonia, Romania, and Turkey, and 2 are members of the EU, Greece and Romania. Bulgaria is a NATO member since 2004 and EU member since 2007. The Balkan region is characterized by high volatility in political and international relations, directly dependent on global and regional powers. The key players for the Balkans are the United States and the European Union on one side, and Russia, China, and Turkey on the other. Due to many historical reasons, Turkey is an important and unavoidable regional factor on the Balkans. Turkey is a major power player in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and a major player in the political gambit in Bulgaria, the Republic of North Macedonia, and Kosovo. This is one of the maps that I prepared for this presentation. Thank you very much. Another potential player with influence in the Balkan political process is Serbia, directly supported by Russia in military, economic, and political field, and by China economically. Thanks to Russia and China, Serbia has shown a growing leadership and role on the Balkans in recent years. Please open the next slide. Initiated the Open Balkan Initiative, also known as Mini Schengen format, which was officially launched in early 2020, through which it openly aims to attract to its sphere of influence Albania and the Republic of North Macedonia, as well as to minimize as much as possible the role of Bulgaria and Kosovo in the region. This Mini Schengen initiative is strongly supported by Russia as an appropriate form of breaking up the EU-NATO bloc in the Balkans and driving a potential wedge into regional bloc cooperation. Serbia is also trying to negatively influence the stability of Bosnia and Herzegovina through the malevolent influence of Serbian ethnic leader Miroslav Dodik and his tools for influencing to the state framework of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Nowadays, I'm going to make a short overview over the Russian influence in the region. And after that, I'm going to make a brief overview country by country. You can remove the slide. Thank you very much. Nowadays, when we are studying terrorism on the Balkans, we shouldn't think for direct terrorist threats like bombings, assassinations, kidnapping, etc. The last terrorist attack in Bulgaria was in 2012 when a Hezbollah operative bombed a bus and killed 6 Israeli citizens and their Bulgarian bus driver. When we talk on terrorism on the Balkans today and in 2022, we must have in mind state terrorism, not a state-sponsored terrorism or state-supported terrorism, when a certain criminal terrorist group was paid, trained, or logistically supported by an authoritarian or totalitarian country to execute a terrorist act in a concrete other country. No, we must have in mind terrorist activities organized and executed by authoritarian or totalitarian government officials. Most of these activities are hybrid or asymmetric, but some of them could be a direct attempt for assassination in the same way and modus operandi as Skripal and Litvinenko cases in Great Britain. I will make a very brief overview country by country, and we'll start with my country, with Bulgaria. 3 years before poisoning of Russian double agent Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia in Salisbury, UK in 2018, there was another but very similar case in Bulgaria. In 2015, a Bulgarian arms dealer, Emilian Gebrev, was poisoned with a nerve agent that many believe was Novichok. Emilian Gebrev was hospitalized in April 2015 after collapsing at the reception he was hosting in Sofia. His son and one of his company's executives also fell ill shortly after, and all three were hospitalized. Gebrev fell into a coma, and doctors surmised he had been poisoned, though they could not identify the poison used. The Bulgarian investigation into Gebrev's poisoning was reopened after Gebrev told the Bulgarian prosecutors he believed the substance used against him would have been similar to Novichok. The story gained little attention at the time, and reports of possible Novichok link only surfaced in Bulgarian newspapers. This situation ended in early February 2019 when the investigative platform Bellingcat claimed it had discovered that a possible suspect in the Skripal's poisoning had been in Bulgaria at the time Gebrev fell ill. 1 year later, in February 2020, Bulgarian prosecutors had charged 3 Russians, Sergei Vyacheslavovich Fedotov, Sergei Viktorovich Pavlov, and Georgy Gorshkov, with the attempted murder, all these 3 in absentia, with the attempted murder of Gebrev and his 2 associates. One of these men, Sergei Vyacheslavoich Fedotov, also went by the alias DVS, according to the Bulgarian prosecutorial authorities. The initials matched the name Denis Vyacheslavovich Sergeyev, a high-ranking officer of Russia's military intelligence service who operated internationally under the name Sergei Fedotov. In October 2018, the Russian news website Fontanka named Fedotov as a suspect in the Skripal's case. A spokesperson for Sofia's prosecutor office told Reuters, quote, "We have identified the man. The names we revealed are the ones we have worked with so far. We believe the initials we have also published represent their genuine identities." End of quote. Vladimir Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, said it was difficult to understand why the Bulgarian poisoning allegation had only come to light several years after the event. And here I'm stopping this story because I know that I'm constrained in the time, but I'll continue with other country, the Bulgarian neighbor Serbia. Serbia is Russia's most loyal ally in the region, and Serbia was rocked in 2018 by a spy scandal. Videos released on YouTube show Russian military attaché's aide, Lieutenant Colonel Georgi Kleban, meeting with a senior Serbian intelligence officer. The two visited a restaurant in Belgrade, the Zemun district. They exchanged envelopes with gifts. One shot clearly shows a Serbian officer pulling out an envelope with currency given to him by Lieutenant Colonel Kleban. Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić has ordered an urgent investigation into the case, and Defense Minister at this time, Alexander Vulin, described the case as serious. It was not clear what type of information the Russian deputy military attaché was interested in. Instead of trying to understand why his Moscow partners are spying on his high-ranking officers, Belgrade is focusing on the nationality of the author of the investigation, Bulgarian journalist Hristo Grozev, who is a member of the Bellingcat platform. Considering Serbia's role in the complex solitaire of Russian spy games in the Balkans, it should be noted that in recent years, Belgrade has become a regional hub for pro-Kremlin hybrid media Sputnik, employing more than 20 local journalists. It aims to expand the Russian presence through the soft power in Serbia and post-Yugoslav space to destabilize the EU's efforts to stabilize the Western Balkans. The fact that the Balkans are an important space for Russian services has also been proven in the cases of Montenegro and the Republic of North Macedonia. Montenegro. In the late fall of 2016, pro-Serbian forces in Montenegro, with the support of Russian military intelligence agents, tried to overthrow the country's legitimate prime minister, Milo Djukanovic. The goal was to kill him in order to stop Podgorica's pro-Atlantic orientation. The Secretary of the National Security Council of Russia, Nikolai Patrushev, flew to Belgrade in person to solve the problem with the two Russian agents that were arrested in Montenegro and transferred from Podgorica to Belgrade. The names of these agents are Eduard Shishmakov and Vladimir Popov, who took part in the aforementioned coup attempt. According to the British newspaper The Guardian, citing a source from the Serbian government, Patrushev apologized for, quote, the crude operation for which its executors did not have the approval of the authorities, end of quote. Despite this declaration, there are documented meetings between Shishmakov and Popov and renowned Serbian nationalist Aleksandar Sinđelić in a Belgrade park. Sinđelić is the leader of the pro-Kremlin organization Serbian Wolves. He volunteered for the separatist side in the conflict in Donbas, eastern Ukraine, where he came into a conflict with the Russian special services. Into a contact, not in a conflict, but when he came into a contact with Russian special services. Shishmakov and Popov handed over 125,000 euros to Sinđelić for the purchase of machine guns and ammunition, as well as to recruit 500 men from Russia, Serbia, and Montenegro and that man to be armed and well-trained with combat experience in third countries. What about the situation in the Republic of North Macedonia? In addition to Serbia and Montenegro, the Russian military intelligence, along with its Serbian counterparts, has sparked tensions in 2017 in the Republic of North Macedonia in an attempt to halt Skopje's ongoing pro-Western orientation. In the spring of 2017, a group of dissatisfied citizens attacked Macedonia's National Assembly and tried to stop the creation of pro-Western majority around the social democratic union, as well as an Albanian to be elected as Assembly's chairman. During the clashes in the Macedonian parliament, Goran Živajlović, the official representative of the Serbian services at the Serbian embassy in Skopje, appeared at the assembly. According to the Bosnian newspaper Journal, Russian spy Vladislav Filipov is the man who ordered the attack of the parliament of North Macedonia in the spring of 2017. The purpose of the attack on the parliament of Macedonia was to kill Ziadin Sela, one of the leaders of the Macedonian Albanians, as well as Zoran Zaev, then preparing to become a pro-Western prime minister of Republic North Macedonia. According to the above-mentioned Bosnian newspaper, the coordination of the Macedonian parliament's attack was on the Bulgarian Black Sea coast, where there was a special equipped villa of Russian military intelligence. The operation plan itself was developed in Belgrade, where the Russian military intelligence has their main residence for the Balkans. And at the end, I'm going to have a brief view on Greece. The activities of the Russian intelligence services managed to embitter the long-prepared celebrations for the 200th anniversary of the establishment of Greek-Russian diplomatic relations. The reason for this was the revelation that agents of the Russian intelligence, under diplomatic cover, tried in the summer of 2017 to recruit high-ranking representatives of Greek intelligence and the Greek general staff, as well as metropolitans of the Greek Orthodox Church. Russian goal was to disrupt the negotiations with the process for resolving the long-running name dispute between Skopje and Athens. Exposed Russian diplomats in Greece have been expelled, and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov's visit to Athens has been postponed for a long period of time. Thus, Russian services have confused relations with another key partner of Russia in the Balkans, such as Greece. As a result of these activities, Athens withdrew its ambassador to Moscow, and it took more than a year for Greece and Russia to normalize relations until Russian President Putin announced that, quote, unpleasant page in our relations has been turned, end of quote. In any case, however, relations between Moscow and Athens are not what they used to be, despite official statement and efforts to demonstrate previous level of bilateral relations. I will wrap up with the rhetorical question, what should be done? Instead of conclusion, I shall present some suggestions and shall limit myself to the main ones. In recent years, the Russian Federation, through all its possible channels of influence, has been working to sway Balkan elites and societies from their path to NATO and the EU. The activity of the Russian special services in the Balkans is intensifying. Their goal is to escalate in a negative direction the already complex intergovernmental, inter-ethnic and interfaith relations and collaboration in the region. The United States should start proactively working in the Balkans to counter Russian hybrid and asymmetric operations, most often presented as misinformation and harmful propaganda. To this end, the United States should focus on supporting non-governmental pro-Western and pro-Atlantic think tanks and media in the Balkans. The United States should support the pro-Atlantic projects that are relevant to the creation of promotion of viable and well-informed media, independent of the authoritarian influence or dubious capital. And at the end, but not as important as in importance, even more active use of the possibilities of the Global Magnitsky Act for investigating by the USA of political corruption in Bulgaria and the Balkans, especially about cases investigating Russian malicious influence. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Ivan, for your analysis of the situation, particularly in the Balkan. You know, I'm tempted to ask Dr. Rafi Grigorian, who worked for many years on Balkan issues, to maybe to ask a question or make a comment, but I see that our colleague from the Department of Justice, Tom Brzezinski, arrived, and I wonder if we can invite him first to make a statement at this point. Tom, are you on?
Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir, I am. And again,
so very briefly, I would like simply to introduce you as a counsel for domestic terrorism in the National Security Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. He was educated at William and Mary, and also received his law degrees, and is also at this time adjunct professor at George Washington University Law School. So I would like to welcome you, and please go ahead now, and we'll come back to the other issues later on.
Well, thank you, and my apologies for the delay in arriving here. I had a previous obligation, unfortunately. But first and foremost, thanks again for the to Professor Alexander, the Inter-University for Terrorism Studies, for the kind invitation to participate in this important session. I will say over the last several years, the Department of Justice has collaborated with experts from many countries all over the world and leading international organizations to tackle what we consider to be the thorniest problems in the counterterrorism arena. And the threat posed by what we understand to be transnational domestic terrorism is certainly one of those issues. One recent example, among many others, of the DOJ's commitment to engage with our foreign partners in this area is our participation in the UNODC's forthcoming Manual on Prevention of and Responses to Terrorist Attacks on the Basis of Xenophobia, Racism, and Other Forms of Intolerance. We also substantially contributed to the International Institute of Justice's recently released Criminal Justice Practitioner's Guide for addressing racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism. I'm gonna call that REMVE as I move forward on this. These are just a few excellent examples of how we all can work together in the international community to identify and promote best practices for confronting common problems in this arena. A little bit on the threat landscape from our perspective. Preventing terrorist attacks, of course, in all forms remains one of the United States Department of Justice's top priorities. And the nature of the threat posed by terrorism, both international terrorism and domestic violent extremism, continues to evolve. According to the FBI, the most significant terrorist threat to the United States at present is posed by lone actors who radicalize, often online, and who seek out soft targets to attack with easily accessible weapons. We see these individualized threats manifested within both domestic violent extremists, including those motivated by racial hatred and anti-authority views, and international terrorists, including global jihadists. Lone actors accounted for 22 of 24 lethal domestic violent extremist attacks in the United States from 2016 to 2020. Among the domestic violent extremists, the top threat we face are what we identify as racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, REMV, specifically those who advocate for the superiority of the white race and who have been the primary source of most lethal incidents of violence in the recent years. Since 2010, for example, REMVs in the United States have been responsible for 24 out of 41 domestic violent extremist attacks and 88 out of 128 deaths during that period, most often using firearms. I'm going to mention a few of these heinous attacks. So you've got June of 2015, where Dylan Roof killed 9 African-American parishioners during a Bible study at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, of course. You remember that? And then, of course, in August 2017, you have James Fields, who intentionally drove his car into a diverse crowd of counter-protesters at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, killing one woman and injuring dozens of others. In October of 2018, Robert Bowers killed 11 Jewish congregants gathered to engage in worship at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. And then in August of 2019, Patrick Crusius shot and killed 23 people and injured several others at a retail store in El Paso, Texas, reportedly targeting Hispanic victims. Now, with regard to the transnational, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremist threat, we've seen some US-based domestic terrorists attempt to establish links with like-minded foreign individuals and organizations. In addition, we're seeing some US-based domestic terrorists travel overseas to meet with like-minded individuals and organizations and establish operations. For example, some members of a US domestic violent extremist groups have traveled to the Ukraine for military training with paramilitary units that are helping to defend Ukraine from Russian aggression, including the Azov Battalion, a Ukrainian paramilitary unit affiliated with the Ukrainian military. And of course, terrorists and their supporters, including our racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, connect with one another via internet platforms and draw inspiration from each other. In his manifesto, Patrick Crusius, the individual who was charged with the El Paso shooting that I mentioned earlier, cited inspiration from Brenton Tarrant, who conducted the racially and ethnically motivated violent attack, killing 51 people in Christchurch, New Zealand, in March of 2019. So finally, I note that this threat is only increasing. The FBI has doubled the number of its domestic terrorist investigations in just the past few years. So it's something we're very concerned about. What are we doing about it? Well, the US government is committed, of course, to using all the tools at its disposal to combat domestic terrorism, regardless of its motivating ideology. And law enforcement and the criminal justice system are obviously going to be central to that effort. The FBI, as I'm sure you can appreciate, is the lead federal agency for countering domestic terrorism in the United States. On the front lines of our effort are nearly 200 FBI joint terrorism task forces in each FBI field office across the country. The JTTS, as they're known, promote training and information sharing at the operational level among federal, state, and local law enforcement, as well as private sector partners in matters relating to terrorism, both international and domestic terrorism. This training and information sharing is critical because there's many more local law enforcement officers on the ground than there are federal agents, and they may be, and often are, the first to come across individuals potentially planning terrorist attacks in their communities. Just a few weeks ago, or actually at this point, it's just a couple months ago, the White House released a new national strategy for countering domestic terrorism, the first comprehensive national level strategy of its kind. Now, there are 4 pillars to the strategy. 1, information sharing. 2, preventing recruitment and mobilization to violence. 3, disrupting and deterring terrorist activity. And 4, confronting the long-term contributors to domestic extremist violence. Now, I want to highlight some of the international aspects of the new U.S. strategy. Among many other things, the strategy calls for greater efforts to illuminate the transnational aspects of domestic terrorism. It sounds kind of strange, but that's exactly what we're contending with. It notes that the U.S. intelligence and law enforcement have identified and are implementing robust information exchanges with our foreign partners regarding foreign connections to the U.S. domestic terrorism threat, principally among the racially and ethnically motivated violent suspects and groups. That increased focus on the intelligence side and on international sharing in this area is new. This is a two-way street, both sharing what we see and obtaining what our partners see. A couple of years ago, the U.S. designated what's called the Russian Imperialist Movement, or RIM, as the first REMV designated foreign terrorist organization. This action bars anyone subject to U.S. jurisdiction from providing material support to this group or receiving training from them. The strategy calls on the Departments of State and Treasury to determine whether other foreign groups can be so designated, and that work is ongoing. The Department of Treasury is also focusing on more on evaluating the financial activity associated with domestic terrorists and their foreign counterparts, and we'll see what fruit that bears as we move forward. We also need to understand better how foreign malign influence and disinformation campaigns supported by some foreign governments fuel racial hatred and domestic terrorist activity and work together with our partners to combat that trend. The strategy also notes that the United States has now endorsed the Christchurch Call, to action to eliminate terrorist and violent content online. This is a big step. We look forward to working with our foreign partners, as well as the US and other technology companies and other stakeholders on that effort, while of course respecting freedom of expression here at home. Now, like most serious threats today, REMV activities cross borders. That's why international partnerships in this area are so important. We recognize emerging commonalities in many recent domestic terrorist attacks in both the United States and abroad, including shared tactics, techniques, and procedures such as the use of manifestos, virtual currencies, and encrypted platforms and gaming sites, among many other things. So we need to work together and learn from each other. Some additional specific measures the DOJ has undertaken to combat domestic violent extremism include the issuance of binding guidance to ensure that investigations and prosecutions with a domestic terrorism nexus are reported to the National Security Division for better tracking and to ensure coordination and consistency across the department in handling all these matters. In addition, the DOJ just announced the creation of a dedicated domestic terrorism unit within the counterterrorism section to handle domestic terrorism investigations and prosecutions. Now, these are but two of many initiatives we hope will better position the department to counter the increasing threat from domestic violent extremism, both at home and abroad. I don't want to close my remarks today without noting that we have had some important successes in the United States in preventing domestic violent extremism and other DVE-related attacks. For example, in 2016, 3 men were arrested for plotting to attack an apartment complex and mosque used by Somali immigrants in Kansas. In 2018, they were convicted and sentenced between 25 and 30 years in prison. In February 2019, a man known as Christopher Hassan was convicted on weapons and other charges. As detailed in the government sentencing memo, Hassan self-identified as a white nationalist for over 30 years, and in writings advocated for focused violence in order to establish a white homeland. He had stockpiled assault weapons, studied violence, and intended to exact retribution on minorities and those he considered traitors. And in January 2020, he was sentenced to more than 13 years in prison. In February of this year, Richard Holzer was sentenced to over 19 years in prison on federal hate crime and explosive charges for plotting to blow up the Temple Emmanuel Synagogue in Pueblo, Colorado. Holzer told undercover FBI agents that he wanted the bombing to send a message to Jewish people that they must leave his town, otherwise people would die. And then just last week, the leader of the Atomwaffen Division, a neo-Nazi organization here in the United States, was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison for his role in a plot to threaten and intimidate journalists and advocates who work to expose anti-Semitism. These success stories never get as much attention as the terrorist attacks that do occur, but they show that with diligence, dedication, and persistence, we can and will achieve these sorts of successes and ultimately save lives. So I'm grateful for everybody who works on these efforts all across the globe, and I certainly look forward to collaborating with you and learning from you as we pursue this common objective. Thank you again for the invitation to attend this session. My apologies for being slightly tardy.
Thank you very much, Tom, for your presentation. If I may, as moderator, because of the time factor, I would like to call on our colleague, Ambassador Charlie Ray. As I introduced him before, he served as a U.S. ambassador in Asia, in Cambodia, Vietnam, and elsewhere, and in Africa, and also was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for POW, Missing Personnel Affairs. So, Charlie, could you make a brief statement at this point, and then we'll try to have some Q&A discussion.
Thanks, Yonah, and as usual, thanks for allowing me to participate with such an august panel of speakers. I am really reassured to have heard the comments today about the broad approach that has to be taken to combating violent extremism and terrorism. In particular, the comments of the last speaker and of Mr. Grigorian of the need to incorporate other than military and law enforcement, which is essential, but not sufficient to deal with the problem in our efforts to not just combat international terrorism, but to take a look at the
problem of domestic terrorism, which can have a significant impact on our ability to deal with international terrorist organizations and require a concerted diplomatic effort to make sure that all of these moving parts move smoothly together. I'm going to thank you, gentlemen, and you too, Dr. Caldwell, for, again, very enlightening presentations. And thanks, Yonah, for letting me be a part of this.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask Professor Don Wallace, may we extend this for another few minutes, the Q&A discussion?
You may.
Thank you very much. Okay, so if I may, I would like to invite our speakers to join and to make a statement or whatever. First, Dr. Rafi Grigorian, still there?
I'm still here.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you for those very interesting presentations. You know, we do have a program on chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear related terrorism. So I was very interested to hear the biological or the biorisk presentation from Ms. Dr. Caldwell. I'm also fascinated by Ivan Anchev's description of what's going on in the Balkans. I think my experience there is consistent with what he described, but because of my current position in the United Nations, I think I'll just leave it at that for the moment. But I have to say I'm captivated by Councillor Brzezowski's presentation on what the U.S. calls REMV. I touched on it in my remarks, Councillor. It is something that the United Nations and the UN Office of Counterterrorism, which I head, is very interested in. We are looking at how to modify our tools to address REMV, and particularly the transnational aspects of it. Everything from travel of people. We have a very robust counterterrorism travel program, but also the financing and other aspects of the transnational nature of it. So I'm sending you a note in the private chat that hopefully we can follow up at some point in the future. But as you can see, the trend, as I mentioned at the beginning, is more and more of this kind of what might be considered domestic terrorism here in the U.S. But they feed off of each other. You know, there's been a lot of mention of anti-Semitism, Islamophobic attacks too. The prominence of and the tactics and techniques that Al Qaeda and Daesh have perfected have been picked up by people in this other sphere, and they're copying each other and using each other as excuses for fomenting violence. And then there was also the mention by Mr. Anchev of the state action of terrorism. You know, so we have large terrorist insurgencies, we have lone wolves or single actors, and then we have state actors now. So it's become a very, very different terrorism landscape than what we had in the, say, 1970s, where we have small groups of radicals hijacking aircraft and stuff like that. So it's a very complicated field nowadays, and we have our work cut out for us. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today and to comment and hear these very interesting presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to invite Bob Revere for any comments.
No, I found it very enlightening. I certainly have found nothing I would protest. I think that is a good, the presentations have showed that it is a very dynamic field, requires flexibility, and it also requires a united effort to meet the challenges that are global at this time.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Rita Caldwell.
Yes, my comment is that I would like to emphasize, in the case of bioterrorism, you can have a single actor, such as the anthrax episode, in which an individual sent out powders and caused several deaths. Or you can have a community, an organized group, as we had in Oregon, where the salad bar was deliberately contaminated with pathogens in order to make people ill so that they wouldn't go to vote, so they could control some issue that they wanted to have their own outcome. And then you have, of course, the state actors. I think, fortunately, except for, at least in the case of COVID-19, we ascribe this to Mother Nature. At least the evidence is in that direction. But it demonstrates what the power of a biothreat can be. So I think we have to be very, very aware, because we haven't had an event, at least brought to the national attention, for quite a while, over a decade or so. But it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen again, and it can be totally devastating. So just wanted to make that additional comment. This has been a superb discussion. I've really learned a lot, and I've appreciated being a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rita. I would like to invite our colleague, Professor Don Wallace, and then, of course, General Gray. Don?
Thank you, Yonah. Well, I just will repeat what everyone else has said. This is another one of your very impressive panels. I think we're learning about a proliferation of many different threats of different nature. And I guess society hopes that we're able to cope. And you've often pointed out that the purpose of terror is to really damage the morale of society. So I think all of these gentlemen, Rafi, Gregorian, the gentleman from the Justice Department, Mr. Brzezowski, I think they're all seized of the fact that they have enormous responsibilities to us, to society. And so, of course, we wish you well. But again, Yonah, thank you so much. And General Gray is there, and we'll be reassured by him, I think. Thank you, Yonah.
Yes.
Yeah, well, just let me thank all the superb panelists again, as everybody else has mentioned. It was a great panel, a great discussion. To me, of course, terrorism remains a tactic. And as long as it can be perceived as being successful, it is going to continue to be around. I wish someday someone would come up with a solution with respect to the media. All the media does is enhance their fundraising ability, enhance their publicity, and talk way too much about what they're doing. That's my main concern. But again, thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your contributions. And let's hope we are entering a better year for societies.
That concludes our presentation today. We thank everyone for participating and for our participants and attendees to join us. And we look forward to our next conference from Yonah in the future. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.